Welcome to the All of Life podcast from Redemption Church Tempe, where we have conversations on faith, culture, theology, and beyond to help us live all of life, all for Jesus. Let's jump into today's episode.
Welcome back to the All of Life podcast, episode 3 of this mini-series on the pursuing God. We're going to land the plane. We're going to talk about what is the stuff we're talking about? What does it mean for us as a people? To be a people who pursue the world as God has pursued us. So I'm excited to have this conversation. We got the whole crew. We got Josh Butler. We got John Crawford. And we got Matney. Thanks, guys, for joining us for this. Here we go. Let's jump in. You guys know the drill at this point. We're seasoned veterans in the Pursuing God format here. There's caricatures, and then there's the reality, the good news of the gospel. So buckle up. Here we go. Josh apparently wanted to make sure clicks happened here with this caricature. So caricature 1, God prefers the polished, the pretty, and put together versus the gospel. God goes after Nazis, whores, victims, and oppressors to make them his people and his bride. And Josh, we gotta start with you. Right. You're the one who wrote it. So what are you talking about?
Yeah, no, it's funny actually. I remember my editor, when they got to kind of like the Nazis and whores language, and they were kind of like, it feels a little, is that too shock? And then they got into the chapter and they're like, oh no, that's perfect. Actually, that's really great. It sets up well what you're talking about, because what I wanted to do in there, I'm really digging into the prophets, the imagery of the prophets. And so with the Nazis imagery, I'm looking at Assyria and looking at the way Nahum and others describe the prophet, the Assyrian Empire that Jonah is called to go to. The Assyrian Empire was brutal. Like what they did to, man, if you want quotes, you can look at some of the descriptions in the book, but I mean, they just skinned people alive.
It's terrible.
The terror
awful.
of the ancient world. That really was, like, when you think about like the Nazis, that was like the ancient world, the Assyrian Empire. What they did to Israel and the peoples they conquered was genocidal, right? And just like their goal was to inflict terror on the people that they crushed. And these are the people that the prophet Jonah gets called to go to and to preach God's reconciliation and forgiveness. And I think sometimes we look at Jonah and his resistance to that is like, oh, come on, Jonah. Like, don't you believe in God's love? Like, it's like, dude, when you've seen your people massacred, when you've seen the terror, like not only terror for your own life to step into the belly of the beast, so to speak, but the anger and the revenge. And we see that as the book of Jonah develops. At the end, the climax, we see Jonah say the reason why he didn't want to go to Assyria was because he knew the immensity of God's mercy and compassion that God might forgive them.
Totally.
And like, dude, so the bitterness in his heart, the reason he didn't want to go, the reason he did not want to embody the pursuit of the pursuing God, like the pursuing God calls Jonah to embody that pursuit and go to Nineveh. The reason he didn't want to go into the Assyrian Empire was because he knew God might forgive them. But God is a God who goes after the Nazis, right? He goes after the people, we would say the oppressors, right? He goes after the Assyrian powerhouse that destroyed Jonah's world. And so that's kind of going, using that image there. And then on the horrors, it's looking at the prophet Hosea and going where God calls Hosea, if you're not familiar with the story, he calls his prophet to marry a prostitute, right? Which, especially back then, dude, is, you can imagine Hosea kind of thinking about like, God again, hey, Hosea, I got a match for you, And Hosea getting all excited. Oh, is it Sally? Jesus, like, she preaches, she sings in the choir and she does whatever, Like, no, it's not Sally, well, is it Becky? She, like, no, not who you expect. Like, God's going, hey, I want you to marry Gomer, a prostitute. And there's a reason behind it. God's going, because I want this to be a picture of my pursuit of my people who have left me and who have abandoned me and who've gone, after other gods, other idols and all. And so Hosea does, and she leaves him multiple times to go back to these former ways, right? And Hosea is called to keep pursuing her. And it's this picture of God who goes after not the Disney princess, queens, whatever, like the fairy tale princess, but God goes after a bride that the world looks at and goes, no, you're going the wrong direction, God. And so I think in that we see this picture that we see throughout, and ultimately in Jesus in the Gospels, he goes after both the oppressor and the oppressed. He goes after both the polished and the put together. He goes after those who are the last kids picked and the people that you wouldn't expect. The extravagance of God's pursuit is that he's not pursuing those that the world, I love the way Martin Luther puts it, that it's not that God loves the beautiful so much as rather that God's love makes us beautiful. You know, it's the reception of his pursuit of us that actually causes us to glow and be transformed with the radiance of his love.
It's good. John, what does this mean for us as a church? What does it mean for us as the people of God?
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news about the heart of God and just this God who is pursuing people is regardless of your story, right? Every one of us sitting here at the table, we all have a story, and they're all different. And that story has led us to sitting around this table, having this conversation about who God is and what he's like. And the beauty is, no matter where you've been, no matter what is in your story, whether you've been a victim, whether you've actually taken advantage of people, whether you've been the one who's oppressed, whether you've been the one who's committed crimes, whether you've got a felony record, whatever it may be, right? There is nothing too dirty for God, and that he is pursuing a people for himself. And that's from all walks of life. That's from the midst of brokenness. That is, maybe you grew up in the church too, and maybe you've been around it. And you know what? God is still pursuing you as well. It's not just that he goes after the Assyrian, but regardless of wherever you've been, God is pursuing, and he's pursuing people for himself. And even as we talked about in the podcast 2 for Pursuing God, about the atonement, about, man, that he has paid the penalty, that you are cleansed through his sacrifice. And so I would say that even for us as a people, that as we follow this God, as we follow Jesus, and as we participate in his mission in the world, as he's given us his Spirit, that let us have the same heart for people that God has. And that at Redemption Tempe, that there's no one outside of God's love. There's no one outside of God's saving grace, that there is no sin too dirty for God to cleanse. Yeah. And so I think that's the kind of people that we want to be, because that's the very God who we serve, and that's the God who has pursued us.
Yeah, that's really good. I think about the arc of this book and the arc of these last couple podcasts. We took the big picture of the pursuing God. Who is this God? And the question of, do we want to be found? And delve into that. And then the center of this story, this God, this pursuing God, dies for us. And we dove into a kind of a deep dive again on the atonement, on what is happening at the crucifixion. And then now we're saying, what kind of people does this make us? People that belong to the pursuing God, a people that are being pursued by the pursuing God. How does that shape us? And I think about this good news being, we're all victims and villains in this story. We're all sinners and have been sinned against in this story. And so the good news is God pursues all of that and all this. Josh, do you want to speak into that? Autumn, do you want to speak into any of that?
Yeah, Autumn, I'm curious, you got any? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I guess I was just thinking that a lot of us probably tend to identify more with like the Pharisees in the Bible versus like those Nazis and the whores and all that. Like, sure, we might have glimpses of things where we're acting like that, but I get the sense that our church and maybe just America in general tends to think more highly of ourselves than that and rest in our works. And I think there's so much danger in that. I know in my own life, I tend to think like, well, I did go to church and I do work for a church and like all that stuff. So that's maybe a danger for me, but realizing that like, God's pursuing me away from that tendency just as hard as he is pursuing people who like seem so far gone or something like that. Yeah.
Dude, that's so good. Like that makes me think about how, I've thought about sometimes about how it's easy to not steal a cow when you got 2 cars. Like sometimes we think, I think in our society, we think we're a lot better than we are, because of our affluence and our wealth, it masks over, like some of the conditions. And yet when I've worked in, I had the chance to work over the years in a lot of like post-genocide areas like Rwanda and Cambodia, places like that. And one of the things that struck me when you meet the folks who both endured and even some of those who participated in the horrors of those things is just how human they are, how normal, how everyday, and realizing the circumstances that drove them really had to do a lot more with the social pressures around them, the hunger, but realizing like, dude, this guy looks like my grandpa. He was a soldier in the Khmer Rouge army that killed, and I think the reality is like we're way worse than we think we are. Like often
Yeah.
like our circumstances kind of mask over the depths of our depravity, but you put us in the right circumstances. Man, I don't get a nap or I don't get my meal, and I don't get a meal and I get all grumpy and cranky, but like how far we would actually go when we get there. And so I think the beauty of the gospel is it gives us the freedom to get honest with the depths in our own story. Because if you think God's out there waiting for you to pursue him, then you got to clean yourself up to get there. But when you realize God's pursuing you, you can get honest and transparent with the depths of darkness in your own heart.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys experienced at all seeing the depths of your own darkness like through COVID. I feel like that, I mean, is like pretty universal across the globe, but especially in America. Like I think that none of us prior to COVID-19, maybe not none of us, very few people experienced walking into a grocery store and being like, there's one bag of potatoes and there's a lady in front of me, like, how hard do I got to hit her to get the potatoes? So I
brought
think
my baseball bat to the grocery store.
Yeah. So in some sense,
You're
it's
a
like
monster.
kind of, yes.
You like potatoes, huh?
Yeah. Those French fries.
Oh.
But yeah, like that's right. Like
Totally.
that what you were saying about it's really easy to not steal a cow when you have two cars. Like I think we just as a society got a glimpse of maybe how evil we can be when those things are threatened in our lives.
I think too it really draws out the scandalous nature of the gospel. And I think even to what you said, Autumn, that I think what's really good is just for a lot of times those of us in the church, even if you're a new Christian, I think it becomes easy to become self-righteous and somehow think that you're better than others, right? And somehow think that like there is somebody who, man, they're wrestling with something or they're living a certain way and they're doing some sort of sinful thing. And now all of a sudden it's easy to cast judgment as far as like, oh, well, God wouldn't accept that person. And we forget that, no, exactly what Josh just pointed out with Jonah even. Like, the gospel is scandalous. Like, this pursuing God that has pursued us, this is scandalous, like that he would tell Jonah, go to the Assyrians. And I think we sanitize pages of the Bible that we're like, oh yeah, we know Jonah was swallowed by a big fish. But you sanitize the entire story of, no, the Assyrians were brutal, like one of the most brutal empires in the history of the world. And no wonder, right? And Jonah knew that this is like the scandalous nature of who God is, like his mercy, that God actually would, right? His mercy would include them. And that's why he went begrudgingly and preached the shortest sermon in the history and was like, forward sermon or whatever he did. And I just think for us, it can become so easy to look down upon someone, or sometimes like we think people are too far gone, right? Like just that too far gone of like, oh yeah, God would never save them, or they're too far out of his saving grace. But yet these are the types of people that God is pursuing. And I think one of the things that has been so encouraging to my faith is seeing these folks who I have even believed, oh man, God's never, they're outside of, they're never gonna, and all of a sudden, they end up coming to faith and you're like, oh my gosh, but it's the scandalous nature of this.
Yeah. And I think one question it raises for us practically is, dude, what kind of church do we want to be? In the sense of going, like, my hope and desire as a pastor is that we would be a church where the porn star would feel comfortable, like being here and learning about Jesus and exploring and Jesus, experiencing Jesus' pursuit, that a former violent criminal, someone who, and obviously you want boundaries of protection in place, kids, things like that, but that person would be pursued. Like I think of a friend of mine who, when I first met at church, was eco-terrorist who had gotten out of years in prison and had an ankle bracelet on, but like became radically transformed by Jesus by getting the Bible in prison, and going, dude, we want to be the body of Christ, a people where it's going, those people aren't looked at like kind of like, should they really be here? But rather they're pursued and embraced and welcomed in. Like it's a part of Jesus's people. I think of, Holly and I were talking about this the other day, like even like, sometimes, part of this is demographics and neighborhood you're in, but let's say like that we would be not just a church that has a ministry to the homeless, but we are a church where the homeless are a part of the church, like our welcome, like it's not just like category of people out there. That's like people who don't have a home would actually find a family like within the body of Christ here. And so I think it casts, the pursuing God casts a vision. Not I'm talking about the book, but I'm talking about the gospel. The gospel of the pursuing God casts a vision for the church as an eclectic ragtag, a group of people who are not going to make sense in the eyes of the world. That why are they all hanging out together? Why are they all, but it's because God is shaping and transforming us together as His people. That hopefully the church looks like a motley crew. Not the band, but the,
Motley Crue.
Kickstart my heart. Let's go. There's so much I want to say, and I'm not right now. All 12 of you that understood that reference, you're welcome. So I think we could interpret this as like a passive thing. Oh, we want to be welcoming. Like if this happens, it happens. But there's two quick quotes in here. It says in the book, The Pursuing God, the pursuing God makes us a pursuing people. The pursuing God makes us a pursuing people. And then Jesus didn't die so I could hang out with my buddies. He died to reconcile a gloriously diverse humanity. I want this to refrain. What does this mean for us as the people of God? Jesus didn't die so I could hang out with my buddies. He died to reconcile a gloriously diverse humanity.
I'll take that one, actually. So I feel like something that our church does well, I think, is our redemption communities. Looking at you, John. Because I feel like it's kind of up to God who shows up to these groups, who is paired together. And oftentimes it's like really otherwise awkward people together, like you will have like someone who's older and someone who's younger. Maybe they believe different things, but we're like creating a space for those people to actually be in community with one another and read the Bible alongside one another. So whereas like on a normal weeknight, you might just hang out with your friends. Like I think that something like a redemption community is really good and healthy, where you open up your home to anybody in this group. And yeah.
I think it's living in response, right, to being pursued. And when you have received, you then want to extend. And so those who are forgiven much, forgive. Those who have received the hospitality of God can then extend the hospitality of God.
Totally.
Those who have been pursued then pursue others. And I think when you begin to see, even with that, taking the quote of when you begin to see that you were on the outside, but yet God pursued you and brought you on the inside, you then live a life in response to that. And now you have eyes to see that the Spirit of God gives you as God's people, that we're not doing this thing on our own, but the Holy Spirit indwells in us and enables us to be this kind of people. And so we're not trying to muster it up on our own, but so you've received then new eyes to then see the people who are on the outside. And then God uses to pursue. And so I would say it's not that you pursue people in order that God would pursue you, but God has pursued you. You were on the outside, and He brought you in. He gave you His Spirit, the very power and presence of Christ, to then continue His mission in the world, to continue what He has done. And so I think we can pursue people because we have been pursued, in the same way that we can forgive people because we have been forgiven, in the same way that we can be a hospitable people because we've experienced the hospitality of God. In the same way, even of we've been talking about generosity and sermon yesterday of we can be a generous people because God has been so extravagantly generous to us. And so I think it's living a life in response to the pursuing God. Yeah.
I think of it too is one of the ways to put it is the pursuing God makes us a pursuing people, which is really what you're saying there. And that the church, how do we think of the church, what the church is? And I put it this way, that the church is not a collection of individuals pursuing God together. Rather, the church is a body of people through whom God is pursuing the world.
Yeah.
That in some ways, this language of pursuit could also be, say, the language of mission. Like God's on a mission to reconcile heaven and earth, to restore creation, to restore humanity. And as we get wrapped up in it, as we receive that mission, as we receive that pursuit, receive God reconciling us to Himself, we become wrapped up in His mission as participants through His Spirit, that we become partners in being a part of this reconciliation project, this restoration project that draws us out of ourselves to step into the lives of others and be about being agents of God's redemptive presence in the lives of people. One thing that I find interesting in this is how it frames what church is.
Yeah.
Even like,
this is the question, what is the church?
Yes.
What's the vision of the church?
Because I before we go to, I think it's not just going, hey, what should I go do?
Yes.
In some ways, this reframes things that we're already doing, and it kind of puts them in proper perspective. So as an example, let's take going to church on Sunday, right? Like I think for a long time, I thought, I think many people can think of it as like, oh, this is something I do for God. Like I'm going to kind of be a good person, to do my stuff, whatever, to do holy things or become a better person, whatever. But I think the Pursuing God reframes it going, no, church isn't a place I go to perform. It's a place I go to be present to God. It's a place that you go to receive.
Yeah.
It's this regular rhythm, this liturgy of placing ourselves under God's word and his sacrament together as a people. And that we talked about this, I think it'd been in episode 1, but this idea that, when I go on Sunday, I go to receive the word of God. I think of it as like the family gathering in the Father's living room where he feeds us with his words. He gives us his words through scripture that we receive together. He gives us his sacraments, like actually the flesh and blood of Christ that feeds us and unites us as a people. And we come in a posture of worship, receiving and responding, reminding ourselves of who God is. And it's a liturgy of reception, of actually receiving from God. And I think that shapes us in some implicit ways. There's a danger when we get away from that, right? So one of the things that I've seen over the years is people try and replace that. When I first got into ministry, a lot of folks were trying to replace that with mission, actually. It was going, hey, Sunday's Sunday. Like we just kind of do it because we've done it. But what it's really about is getting out in the homeless shelter or getting out in the city and doing evangelism.
Do the work.
It's really about mission and getting out there. And what I saw over time was a lot of those folks that were all about quote unquote mission, but began devaluing and even disconnecting. We had a number of ministries I helped be a part of that we launched that eventually said, we don't need the church. We're doing it because we're out on the streets, And what I saw over time was a lot of the folks who were all about quote unquote mission actually, and when they devalued and disconnected themselves from Sunday, actually burnt out and got into this place where it didn't last. It broke down over time. Then I saw another wave, maybe 5-10 years later, where it was all about community, where it's going, well, yeah, Sunday's Sunday, it's kind of this ritual, but what it's really about is being life on life, and we're living in the same, house. We're all 10 of us moving to the same home together. We're like this. The version of community tends to be like really intense. Like we got to do everything together.
7 days a week.
7 days a week. And those tended to implode over time. I think of like the
Shocking.
The parish house church movement where. I've seen a lot of those be really healthy and good,
Sure.
But when they were a reaction, I saw a big difference when they're saying this is a way to do it that's maybe missionally contextual to our time, and others who were going, this is the way to do it because it's not about that, it's about us doing this thing right. And those all imploded and were as dysfunctional as anything over time. And now today, I'd say in our time today, what I see more is like spiritual formation and spiritual practices become like the new thing. Like this is like, it's really about this. Like Sunday, that's okay, that's what it is. But it's really about these formation, these practices, things we do, these disciplines. And those are good, but I see a lot of folks in that crowd devaluing and even disconnecting from Sunday. And my concern is how that is shaping and liturgically forming you is that it's really about what you're doing to kind of disciple and form and shape yourself for God, And I think there's a danger, in essence, when we disconnect from the liturgy of why we gather on Sundays to receive, is that, yes, out of receiving from God should flow mission, should flow community, should flow, practices, things that shape and form us. But when you disconnect that from the root of receiving God's pursuit in your life, and the way that that's historically in the corporate gathering of God's people, these rhythms that God has given us, I think you implode in the long haul. Like, I don't think it has the sustainability or longevity. Yeah. And so I've become kind of an old fuddy-duddy. I think, what about the church? I kind of come back to like, dude, I think word and sacrament is at the core. Like, we gather as God's people, as his family, to receive from our Father, to receive from Christ, his word, his sacrament. And I think it forms us in a posture of receiving.
Yeah.
I also think about Sundays being like a practice of like taking yourself off the throne, realizing that you're like a piece of a community. And I don't think there's that many things out there right now that remind us that we're like not the king, so we live in such an individualistic society. And so to come to church and be like, okay, I'm going to offer what I have here, but it's not about me. It's about like us and like the world and what God's doing. So that's a good practice. I think you miss out if you don't go, if you're not like part of a church regularly. Yeah.
Think about the liturgy, somebody who was a worship pastor for a long time, as liturgy is a reorientation of reality. It's also, as a receiving from God, and that'll produce renewal, and that'll hopefully like fuel us until we gather again. And obviously there are small groups and other things that are also this, but there is something unique about when God's people gather around word and table that is unique.
Well, and it's side note, I think it's interesting that it shapes us. A lot of the work that people are doing right now on liturgy and rhythms, practices, we think, I don't know liturgy, but like just your rhythms and practices, how they shape and form you.
Yes.
They really do shape and form you. Rebecca McLaughlin has a great study, or the first chapter in her book, Confronting Christianity, is on like the impact of church attendance, right? And it's really interesting because the assumption is, it doesn't do anything. Dude, the studies are like, live longer, healthier, better marriages, like this, and it's even accounting for socioeconomics and where people are at demographically. Like a lot of like scientists from Harvard are going, better than stopping smoking is actually starting going to church. Wow. Like the health impact that and I think that's it's not so much like, it's because of that one thing the pastor said in that one sermon back when, no, I think it's actually built more into the rhythms of being people who are regularly gathering together before Christ, under his word, receiving that together in a posture of worship. All those things, I think they shape and form us way more than we recognize and have impacts that are way broader than we realize.
Dude, totally. And you even think about the ways in which the Spirit is operative on a Sunday corporate gathering of God's people. Like the Spirit is going to do something. And I feel like even the Spirit's operative in our lives outside of the corporate gathering, but the number of people that I talk to who on a Sunday feel like the Spirit has spoken directly to them, right? The number of people who I know who come to church and they are not even following Jesus yet, but they're like, man, it just makes me feel so much better, And not that it's all about you, but to your point of there is something for your overall holistic health that happens, like just the effects of Sunday attendance. But I think, one of the things too of just going to the gathering to receive, I think something that you said, Autumn, too, that is really good of we're so individualistic, right? It's like you have your personal relationship with Jesus. It's all about you and Jesus. And now I think even what we're seeing on the tail end of COVID is how many people have disconnected themselves from a local church. And because every pastor is putting their sermons online, well, now it's just you and Jesus, and you can watch whatever pastor you want, some of the best preachers, and it's just downloadable at your fingertip, and you've removed yourself from community, you've removed yourself from a corporate gathering, and what I would say is that's only sustainable for so long.
Yeah.
Right.
You will end up drifting, and it's the same way with mission, community, spiritual formation. If that's your anchor and that's your thing, it's only sustainable for so long, but yet coming together as God's people to receive, and that God uses that.
I actually have a question for John. So if anyone's listening to this podcast and they heard the sermon on Sunday where the main message was that you come to church to like participate and to like give of your talents and your time and to contribute to the community. So how do you reconcile that with this message of like, we come to Sunday and to church to receive? So like I'm wondering if anyone's confused about that message exactly.
Side note really quick, when this comes out, it'll be a little bit after. So we're saying the message on Sunday, you mentioned that earlier too, but it'll be a couple weeks back, just for context. Yeah.
Early July.
Yeah,
anyway.
4th of July sermon.
Yeah, there you go.
That's a great question. And so I think the part of the illustration in that sermon as well of the difference between a restaurant and a potluck is to try to draw that out. And the restaurant is all about getting, being served, your preferences, all of that, which makes you you're coming to church just to be served and you're consuming, right? But the potluck is really the image of your approach to church, which you receive, you're getting to eat, but you're also contributing. And so I think how to kind of, tie these two things together of you do come on a Sunday and you receive the word and the sacrament, but at the same time, you're contributing. You're not just coming as a consumer to say, hey, it's all about me, it's all about my preferences. And I think that you tease that out a lot of if you're coming on a Sunday with the restaurant approach, then you know what? The preacher who's preaching, that's not the preacher I like. And so I'm just going to either tune out or I'm going to leave.
Go to another restaurant.
Yeah, go to another restaurant.
Totally.
And you know what? I don't like the person that's leading worship because, we rotate preachers, we rotate, musicians a lot of times. And so, hey, you know what? I don't like that you guys are doing this on a Sunday and I don't like, and it becomes all about your preference And so what we want to push against is, hey, that's not actually the healthy or biblical approach to the church. But yet what you do see is this potluck playing out in the life of God's people as far as, you come and you receive, you will receive, but yet you also contribute. And that's the church is not just us here sitting around this table who are the paid employees, right? But the church is the community of God's people who are gathered. And therefore, he's gifted each one of us with different gifts, with different talents, with different passions, all of those things, and contribute to the life of the church, contribute to the well-being of the church, because it's not just us, and we can only do so much here. And so that's where I would say they integrate.
Cool. Yeah, it's a good distinction, I think.
I think with this, we receive so that. Like, not just receive, period. I receive so that, blessed to be a blessing. We see this, we should actually absolutely be coming with a sense of expectancy to receive, to experience God's presence. But there's a sense of, an analogy here of, you don't fill up your gas tank to go leave your car in the garage. Like the gas is meant to do something. And the car is meant for the road. It's meant to drive. It's meant to take you somewhere. And of course, this analogy is going to fall apart somewhere. But there's a sense of God is filling us up. We're experiencing His presence. We're being refreshed, renewed, so that we can go be a blessing to the world. And I think with that caricature, what you say, Josh, in this, so the caricature was the church is a collection of individuals pursuing God together, versus the church is a body of people through whom God pursues the world.
And one other thing I'd add to that is that it's in our own lives as well. I'd say that not only the pursuing God makes us a pursuing people, but also the pursuing God pursues us through His people. Right? And so in my life, in your life, in our lives, like God pursues us not in a vacuum, but actually through one another. One of the central images of this in the Bible is the body of Christ. And the image is that Jesus is the head, but we're all a body, and the eye can't say to the arm, I don't need you. The arm can't say to the ear, I don't need you. Like, we need each other because it starts with us receiving life from our head, from Christ, our source, right? Yeah. And yet we receive His presence, His Spirit, and as He grafts us to His body, the Spirit of God begins to draw out of us these diverse gifts that contribute to our life together as a whole. And I love, there's the old missionary theologian Leslie Newbegin, and he talks about how often we want to approach God. He asked the question, we want to approach God through the skylight, but God prefers to approach us through the front door. And what he means by that is, like, in most religions of the world, mindset of the world, the idea is we want to approach God through the skylight. We want to kind of open up the heavens and have this one-on-one encounter, whatever. But he goes, there's something in the gospel that God prefers to encounter us through the front door of the neighbor who comes bringing the good news. Like, how blessed are the feet of those who bring good news. And he asked the question, why is it that God chooses to approach us through the front door rather than the skylight? Wouldn't the skylight be easier, And his observation is because God is not out to just have a bunch of one-on-one scattered relationships with all these random individuals. God is out to form a communion, a body of people who share His life together, And so what that means is we actually, not just when we hear the good news of the gospel, but continuing in the life of faith, like God continues to pursue us through each other and through one another.
It's good. I have a question for each of you. Maybe think about, God's reconciling us to Himself and to one another. John, I'm going to start with you. This vision we're talking about, I don't want to put a sentence on just everything we're talking about. How do you hope that shapes the vision and just what people experience at Redemption communities and groups at Redemption Tempe?
Yeah, I would even say even bigger than just RCs and Redemption communities. I would just say any of the communities at our church. Totally. I think one would be that we would share the very heart of God, of that we would be pursuing people, right? That we have been pursued. And so therefore we would be, kind of like what I talked about a few minutes ago, is now we live life in response to this. And so we pursue people, we extend the hospitality, we're generous people, we're forgiving people, and we participate in what God is doing in communities. And so that has massive implications on, well, who do you welcome in? Because like Autumn's saying, sometimes RCs are like, dude, it's a hodgepodge of people that maybe you wouldn't really choose to hang out with, but you're not trying to build your all-star team of friends in Christian community. I mean, look at the disciples that Jesus gathered together.
Zealots and tax collectors together.
But what you're doing is you're saying, hey, we have been pursued by God.
Yeah.
And we want to be in community with each other, to be a pursuing people. And we want to be shaped and formed more into his image. And so therefore, some of these people might not be your best friends, but yet it's sharing God's heart and his action as far as what does he do, because we've been given his spirit. And so I think, who do you welcome in? Because I do think the natural tendency for churches is it's easy to get comfortable. It's easy to say like, hey, I got my huddle and it's pretty clean and it's pretty easy. And man, if we invite that person in, it's going to disrupt some stuff, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe God is actually calling you to disrupt some stuff in your life. And I even think about what Josh was saying a few minutes ago about, well, what kind of church do we want to be? Yeah. And I do think we want to be a church that is diverse. And that's not just across ethnicity with ethnic diversity, but some of these things start to get messy when you start talking about socioeconomic diversity. Yeah. And, are we welcoming the person experiencing homelessness? Are we welcoming people who maybe have some psychological things going on and have mental health stuff? And man, they're going to actually maybe require a little bit more care from our community, that we would pursue them in that way. And are we welcoming the person who's struggling with same-sex attraction? And man, maybe we're going to have to be in community in a little bit different way with sensitivities and a little bit more care. And see, those things aren't necessarily the most convenient thing if we're just saying, hey, we've already got our friend group. They require that you pursue people and that you open up your life. And the even definition around hospitality that we've used is that you are intentionally making room to give of yourself and receive the other. And are we going to receive the other in our life the same way that God has received us? And so I would say that would be one kind of big thing for us.
It's really good. It's really good. Josh, question for you. Wherever somebody's listening to this, they're only a couple days away from a Sunday, right? At most, you're 7 days away from a Sunday. Literally Sunday.
The preacher knows Sunday's coming. Sunday's like coming. A freight train. It keeps coming.
It is. How do you hope this shapes people as Sunday is coming? How do you want this to shape the life of our people?
I'll answer that with a vision kind of image I had some years ago. And the image was this city where it was dry, it was dusty, there was no water and all that, and it was like a drought kind of thing, right? But then I saw churches around the city depicted as like drinking fountains. And it was a place where people were coming to receive from God's presence, receive God's presence. And here's the context of what I'm thinking. I think one of the challenges that we have right now as churches is some of the way that church has been set up in America, that historically the last 50, 100 years, whatever, it seems like we kind of looked at churches like, this is where you go to get the teaching, right? Like pastor's been to Bible college or been to seminary or whatever, he's got the teaching and we don't. And so we go to church and he gives us the teaching. And essentially we've tended to look the last 1,500 years primarily as like churches where you go to get the good teaching. Now, I think the danger of that today is going, dude, I can get better teaching online, dude. I can download a sermon from whatever, I can get Bible, I can get seminary classes, I can get all that stuff online if I want. And so if you're looking to church primarily as this is where I go to get the good teaching, then in some ways it's like, well, why do I even need that anymore, right? But I think historically, you look at broader sense of going like, no, the church is the gathering of God's people where Jesus feeds us with his word, with his sacrament, with his presence, like in his spirit, something about the corporate life together where he pursues us together through his people and with one another. And going, dude, historically a lot, there's a high view of the sacrament where it's going, you can't download the Eucharist, you can't download the body of Jesus. And it's the body that forms us as a body, like it makes us. But I've also had the sense that the image or this vision represented was going, I sense that God has been allowing the church in America to experience somewhat this drought. And for many who are going, I'm only here for the teaching and now I can get that online, so I'm out, that God's allowed that to prune the church in some way. I think COVID as well, God has pruned the church from those. It was crazy what John mentioned, like half our pre-COVID attendance is gone, but our giving has stayed the same, which I think speaks to something about your core. Like this is my family, this is where we're in this together. And I think God's allowed that pruning to happen, but the sense I had in that vision was on the other side of that pruning, that drought, was going to be a fresh outpouring of God's Spirit, of his presence. And you can't download that online. You can only get it through God's people. God's going like, the way that you're going to access my Spirit, my presence in this season ahead is it's through my people, it's through the gathering. And I would say, dude, we're here. This is probably a topic for another podcast, but John and I, we've been hearing stories of healing this last few months of like even this last week or so ago, like 2 stories of radical healing, serious illness in our congregation, like through prayer. And we're hearing more and more of that picking up. And that's just one angle on, I think, this outpouring of God's Spirit, his presence in some fresh new ways that are really exciting. And so I would say, as you're looking towards Sunday, like come in with a sense of anticipation and going, dude, this isn't this thing I'm doing for God. This is gathering together with God's family to receive from our Heavenly Father, to allow Jesus to feed us as his people, to orient ourselves in a posture of worship, of receptivity to him, and responding with praise and worship as his bride, as his people.
That's great. Autumn, I want to kick this over to you. So we hear this. Sunday's coming. You got 2 young kids that have energy. Yeah. And you're not the only family that's got young kids. Right. You know, you go into the Tempe parking lot, we could get Suzanne on here and she'd talk about how many kids are in the church. Yeah. You know, this sounds motivating and inspiring, but it's Sunday morning. Kids are crazy. You're trying to load up into the minivan. What do you want to say to families that are like wrestling with like the overwhelming, like life feels overwhelming? How do we engage in this? What does that look like to even just the practical step into this reality of responding to the God who's pursuing you?
Yeah. I mean, I guess when you say that, it just makes me think that like the enemy can work in lots of ways. And one of those ways sometimes can be just making it hard to get to church. So like what you said, like I swear Sunday mornings, my kids are crazier than any other day. And it just, there's this temptation to be like, well, forget it. Let's just stay home. So totally. I think that there is just that much more reason to push through and to make it here to your family. And there's rest here. There's rest for your mind and your spirit, and also your kids get to hear about Jesus from somebody that's not you. And hopefully it then makes it even more powerful when you are reiterating what they're learning from other people. I know for my son, for instance, he's really kind of intense. And so if I'm telling him something only, he's going to push back at me like consistently. But if he's hearing it from like his aunties and uncles, you know, all our close friends, and you know, the people in the kids' classrooms, like that's gonna seep into his heart more, and then I can help cultivate that when we get home as well.
It's good.
Yeah.
I think about there was a couple Christmases ago that my family we were trying to get home for Christmas, and we had 8 hours of delay in Salt Lake City with snow, and we had rental car delays, and this turned into almost a 24-hour deal. And you just keep pushing through all these barriers because I just got to be home. I got to get home with my people where there's going to be rest, where there's going to be refreshment, where I'm going to be cared for, where I belong. And I was like, do we feel that way about the church? Do we feel that like I'm willing to push through delays at the airport? I'm willing to deal with the chaos of that because I just got to get home with my people. In the sense of, I just want to give us that image of we're willing to push through to when the holidays come, family vacation, whatever it might be, because we believe there's something there for us that gives life.
Totally.
And tagging off that, man, one of the things that I've loved as I've gotten older is when I go home, when we, you know, especially my mom's house, and there's something about sitting on the couch, eating the fresh cooked meal. I find there's a weight and a pressure of life that comes off my shoulders when I'm in the home of my mother, you know, and like being there with family. And there is this sense of like going, oh, this is the place you come to receive. You know, she delights to give, you know, like to prepare those things, do those things. And I think similarly, like with the life of the church, I feel like that's something like the image that we should have as what you're fighting to get to. It's not so you can get there and strive. It's so you can it's like you're fighting through the obstacles to get home for the holidays, to get back for that meal or whatever, so that when you get there, you can receive. And what we're going to fight for in this pastoral leadership and as leaders here is to cultivate a place where when we gather, that you are receiving gospel, that you're receiving the life of Jesus, that you're being refreshed and built up as the body of Christ through Christ, his Spirit, his word, and our life together. And
it's good.
Yeah.
It's no coincidence that as you walk up to the sanctuary, Autumn is the one who wrote it. It says, welcome home. Yeah. I just want to press into that. As we close this mini series on the pursuing God, Josh, I'm going to try to channel my inner Jim Mullins here.
All right.
And I'm going to try to ask you an obscure question.
Excellent. All right.
It's got to happen, or else I don't think it's an All of Life podcast here. So, Josh, if you could only keep one chapter of the book, what would it be and why? This book has to go down, and your chapters are only like 5 pages, so you only get a small chunk. What is the one chapter that is going to be kept and it's going to be distributed to everyone who gets this resource? It's only one chapter, though. What is it and why?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer it with actually maybe a few contenders and why. So chapter 7 first comes to mind. That's the one of the lost sheep and the word lost, probably because that's the one that I think it's more powerful when you've read the chapters prior, but I've had so many people say that was the one.
So that's like the bronze medal. Olympics are coming up. It gets like bronze.
That's the lost means love.
Lost means love. Yeah. So that's
I
the
love
lost
that
means
chapter.
love chapter. And I think that one, there's something about, I think again, against the backdrop of what's come, but I think that one has seemed to have really packed a punch for people, as well as the one with the Misha story comes shortly after that, which we talked about in another podcast. But so that one comes to mind first. For me personally, though, something for me, the heart of the book was really in the crucifixion section we talked about last week. And so, if I'm thinking about, for folks out there, chapter 7 comes to mind. But when I think about, for me, one of those chapters on atonement, maybe like the first one, just about Jesus actively going to the cross, coming after us in our world. But then my other contender is kind of the first chapter in the resurrection section is on the Trinity. And if you've read it, it kind of explores the imagery in Rublev's icon. And that one, I feel like that gets to the heart of the identity of God, what it means. The Trinity, we can think of like this abstract, but that tried to get into the heart of like God as a communion of love. The Trinity is the foundation for God as a communion of love. And what I've been trying to do in the whole book is to help us see the reality of who God is as a triune communion of love expressed throughout the biblical story. Like it's the foundation for the pursuing God.
Josh just gave you a very Josh Butler answer.
No, dude, come on. He gave me like 8 chapters.
No. He just gave you a Trinitarian answer to your one question. He gave you 3 answers.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to let it slide.
It was 3 answers, but it was one, one response.
I'm going to let that slide here. Josh, thank you for writing this book. I know it shaped a lot of people. I know it shaped my life. I know it shaped everyone around this table's life. God's using it, and it's helping us see and delight in and understand our God, who is the pursuing God. So thanks for writing it. It's a gift. I hope all of you listening, you have got a copy and you can dive into it. Thanks everybody for being on this. And John Crawford.
I want to say one more thing about the book. If you know people in your life who are asking questions about Christianity, this is the number one book that I recommend for people. And so Josh has been gracious enough to give me a few copies that I've been able to give out to people. This is the most helpful book on understanding just, what is the gospel? What is the heartbeat of God? What is the biblical story? And then drilling into some of these tough questions. But Josh has the ability to flip and, shift paradigms and really draw out the beauty of this. And so I would just say, man, if you know people that are exploring, asking questions, or maybe that's even you, I would say this is an amazing resource. But if you haven't read it, regardless of where you're at, even if you walked with Jesus for 30 years, read it. It is a very worshipful book.
It's good. Let us be, church, a people that image the pursuing God well by being a pursuing people. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the All of Life podcast. See you later.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the All of Life podcast. To get more information on Redemption Church Tempe, you can download the Redemption Tempe app, or you can send an email to tempe@redemptionaz.com.